Do you know what I've realized? What's that? I don't know if anyone in my life actually loves me. Sir, that's not true. My family wants my money. My business partners want my connections. People I barely know call me their best friend. But if I lost everything tomorrow, who would still be standing beside me? You don't need to lose everything to find out. What if I did something they could never recover from? What are you talking about? I want everyone to believe I'm dead. Sir, that's insane. Maybe. But I'll finally know who loved me and who only loved my money.
He had billions of dollars, a beautiful home, a powerful family, and people everywhere calling him a friend. But one question kept him awake at night. If all his money disappeared, who would still love him? So he made a decision that would change everything. If this story hooked you already, smash that like button and subscribe. Let's get into it. Nathaniel Cross had built an empire worth $14 billion, and lately, he'd started wondering if a single person in his life actually knew him separate from it. The thought hadn't arrived all at once. It had crept in slowly, over months, in small moments he used to brush past without examining too closely. His daughter, Vivian, calling not to ask how he was, but to mention, almost in passing, that her boutique needed just a little bridge funding before quarter's end. His business partner of 18 years, Harold, suggesting over drinks that Nathaniel should start thinking about succession planning with a casualness that felt less like concern and more like inventory. His second wife, Diane, whose affection had a way of intensifying precisely around the times his portfolio made headlines and cooling, almost imperceptibly, whenever the market dipped. He told himself he was being paranoid. Successful men often were, he reasoned. Wealth made you suspicious by necessity, taught you to read angles in every kindness because so often there was one hiding beneath the surface. But paranoia had a way of asking to be tested, and one particular evening gave him the test he hadn't been looking for. He'd come home early from a trip that had been canceled last minute, walking quietly into his own study to find the door slightly ajar and voices drifting out. Diane's, and his younger brother Charles's, low and unguarded in the particular way people spoke when they believed no one was listening. "He's not going to live forever," Charles was saying, "and when he goes, if that will isn't restructured, Vivian gets the majority stake, and the rest of us get scraps. You need to talk to him about updating it before something happens." "I've tried," Diane said, irritation sharpening her voice. "He gets strange about it, suspicious, like he thinks I'm only asking because—" She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung there anyway, damning in its incompleteness. Nathaniel stood frozen in the hallway, his own house suddenly feeling like enemy territory, listening to two people he loved discuss his death as a logistical inconvenience standing between them and a number. He didn't confront them. He simply closed the door quietly, went to his car, and drove for 3 hours with no destination, turning the conversation over and over, searching for an innocent explanation, and finding, every time, that the explanation existed, but the sting remained regardless. He needed to know, not suspect, know. The idea, when it finally arrived, felt insane even as he began seriously considering it, and that insanity was precisely what made it feel necessary. If he simply asked people whether they loved him for himself or his fortune, he would get the same performance he always got: polished reassurances designed to protect access to what he controlled. The only way to see the truth clearly was to remove himself entirely from the equation. Not confront them, disappear. He spent 6 weeks quietly arranging it, using resources and contacts most people never knew he had. A private security firm accustomed to discretion, a physician willing to falsify medical documentation for a considerable but manageable fee, a small circle of exactly 3 people sworn to absolute secrecy. His longtime driver, Marcus, who had been with him since before the first billion, His personal attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Rosalind Vance, who'd handled his affairs for over a decade and had never once, in all that time, asked him for anything beyond her fee, and a private investigator he trusted to monitor his family's real reactions once the news broke, rather than the reactions performed for cameras. The plan was simple in its cruelty. A private jet, chartered for a routine business trip over open water, would report engine failure and go dark mid-flight. No confirmed remains, given the depth of the water and the violence of the supposed crash. Just enough ambiguity to make a death certificate plausible without inviting the kind of forensic scrutiny that might unravel the lie. Nathaniel would never board the plane at all. He would simply vanish from his own life at the exact moment the world believed he'd fallen out of it. The night before it happened, he sat alone in his study, the same room where he'd overheard Charles and Diane weeks earlier, and wrote 3 letters he had no intention of sending yet. One to Vivienne, one to Diane, one to Harold. He didn't know, writing them, which version of each person would eventually read them, the one who mourned him honestly, or the one who'd been waiting, quietly, for exactly this moment to arrive. He sealed the letters, locked them in a drawer only Rosalind had the key to, and looked around the study one final time, memorizing it the way a man memorizes a room he's not sure he'll ever stand in again as himself. Then he picked up his phone and made the final call to Marcus, who was waiting exactly where they'd planned, engine running, headlights off. "Are you certain about this?" Marcus asked quietly, watching him in the rearview mirror. Nathaniel looked back at his house one last time. The lit windows, the life he'd built, the people inside it who had no idea that by morning, their entire understanding of loss, loyalty, and love was about to be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. "I need to know who actually stays," he said, "even when there's nothing left to gain by staying." Marcus pulled away from the curb, and somewhere over the ocean 6 hours later, a jet with no one aboard but a skeleton crew paid to disappear afterward sent its final transmission, and Nathaniel Cross, $14 billion, and utterly alone in the truth he was about to uncover, officially ceased to exist. The news broke at 6:14 the next morning, and by noon, it had reached every major outlet in the country. Billionaire Nathaniel Cross, presumed dead in Pacific jet crash. Photographs of him from a decade of magazine covers filled screens across the world, alongside grim analyst commentary about what his death meant for markets, for his companies, for the $14 billion now suspended in a strange legal limbo, while lawyers determined what came next. Nathaniel watched all of it from a rented cabin 4 hours from anywhere that mattered, sitting in front of a laptop with a face he no longer recognized staring back at him from every headline, feeling something he hadn't expected, not triumph at the plan working, but a hollow, disorienting grief, as though he really had died, and was now watching his own funeral unfold from somewhere outside his body. Rosalind called that evening on the burner phone they'd arranged, her voice clipped and professional even now. "The will reading is scheduled for Thursday. I've had eyes on the house since this morning, per your instructions. You should know. It's already starting." Starting how? Charles arrived at the estate within 3 hours of the news breaking, not to comfort Diane, to ask her, apparently within earshot of the housekeeper, whether she'd spoken to the estate attorney yet about accelerating probate. Nathaniel closed his eyes. Some part of him had expected this, had built the entire plan around the assumption that Charles's greed would surface quickly. Confirmation didn't feel like vindication. It felt like watching a wound open exactly where he already knew it existed. And Diane? Rosalind hesitated, which told him more than whatever she said next. She's grieving, publicly. Cameras, a black dress, a very composed statement about the great man the world has lost. Privately, she's already had 2 calls with your estate attorney about liquidity timelines. She wants access to the joint accounts released before probate clears, citing immediate expenses. What immediate expenses does a woman with $40 million of her own money have? That's what I asked myself, Rosalind said quietly. The investigators' reports over the following days painted a picture Nathaniel had feared, but hadn't fully let himself believe until he saw it laid out, cold and specific. Harold, his business partner of 18 years, had convened an emergency board meeting within 48 hours, technically appropriate given the circumstances, except the primary agenda item wasn't honoring Nathaniel's legacy or stabilizing the company for employees who depended on it. It was accelerating a buyout clause that would let Harold acquire Nathaniel's shares at a valuation set before his death, well below what they'd be worth once the estate settled, and the board could properly assess the company's position without a grieving family desperate to simplify things quickly. Vivienne, his daughter, called Diane 3 times in the first week, not, according to the investigators' careful notes, to check on her stepmother's well-being, but to ask pointed questions about the timeline for the will reading, and once, overheard through a restaurant table too close to where the investigator had been seated, to a friend, "I know it sounds awful, but I need to know what I'm actually getting before I can plan anything. The boutique's been bleeding money for months." Nathaniel read that particular report 3 times, sitting alone in the cabin, and felt something in his chest cave in that had nothing to do with money at all. He had built Vivienne's entire childhood around presents disguised as provision, private schools instead of bedtime stories, expensive vacations instead of ordinary Tuesdays, a credit card instead of a father who showed up to her school plays. He had told himself, for years, that the money was love, translated into a language he understood better than words. Watching her grieve him through a spreadsheet confirmed something he'd been avoiding for a decade. He'd taught her, without meaning to, that this was the only language that mattered between them. Not everyone's reaction fit the pattern he'd feared, though the exceptions were smaller, quieter, easier to miss if he hadn't been looking so closely. Marcus, still working his cover role as the family's driver, despite knowing the truth, reported that the household staff, people Nathaniel barely remembered by name most days, had organized their own small memorial, pooling money from modest salaries to plant a tree in the garden he used to walk through when he needed to think. His old assistant from decades earlier, a woman he'd let go during a cost-cutting restructure 8 years prior and hadn't spoken to since, sent a handwritten letter to the estate, not asking for anything, simply recounting a memory of Nathaniel staying late to help her file insurance paperwork for her sick mother, a small kindness he'd genuinely forgotten he'd ever done. And then there was the report that stopped him completely, the one Rosalind flagged separately from the rest, marked urgent. Someone had been visiting the cemetery plot reserved for him, the empty one, since there was no body to bury, just a modest memorial marker the estate had erected for public grieving, nearly every evening since the crash. Not for the cameras, not during visiting hours when reporters might catch a useful photograph. Late, alone, after dark, staying only a few minutes each time. Marcus had followed discreetly enough to identify who it was, and when Nathaniel read the name in the report, he sat completely still for a long time, because it was someone he hadn't expected to think of him at all. Someone who, by every financial calculation and every reasonable measure of self-interest, had absolutely nothing to gain by mourning him honestly. The name in the report was Sophia Reyes, his housekeeper's daughter, 26 years old, someone Nathaniel had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in his life. Always brief, always in passing, the kind of interactions wealthy men had with the extended orbit of their household staff without ever truly registering them as people with full lives of their own. He remembered her only in fragments, a quiet girl who used to do homework at the kitchen table, while her mother, Marisol, finished her shifts, years ago, when Sophia was still in high school, and Nathaniel occasionally worked late enough to cross paths with her in the hallway. He remembered, vaguely, funding her college tuition once, not out of any particular attachment, but because Marisol had mentioned, carefully, almost apologetically, that Sophia had gotten into a nursing program she couldn't afford, and Nathaniel had written a check the way he wrote most checks, quickly, without much thought, the way a man distributes small kindnesses he doesn't expect to be remembered for. He hadn't thought about either of them in years. Marisol had retired 18 months earlier after a decade of service, replaced by a rotating staffing agency Diane preferred for reasons of efficiency. Nathaniel hadn't even attended Marisol's small retirement gathering, sending a generic gift basket through his assistant instead, already halfway distracted by whatever deal had consumed him that particular week. And yet here was Sophia, visiting an empty grave every evening, alone, for a man who had barely acknowledged her existence beyond a single tuition check nearly a decade earlier. "Keep watching," Nathaniel told Marcus. Quietly, "I need to understand what this is." The reports that followed only deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. Sophia wasn't visiting to be seen. She actively avoided the small cluster of reporters who occasionally lingered near the estate's public memorial, timing her visits for exactly the hours when no one else would be there. She didn't post anything online, didn't reach out to any outlet offering to share a personal story, didn't attend the memorial service the family eventually held, the lavish, cameras everywhere affair Diane organized, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who understood optics better than grief. Instead, according to Marcus's careful notes, Sophia had quietly begun volunteering at the community health clinic Nathaniel's foundation funded. The same clinic Elena had once taken him to visit, back before any of this began, back when he still thought his money could simply speak for him, in rooms he didn't have time to enter personally. Sophia had shown up the week after his death was announced, asking to volunteer extra shifts, telling the clinic director, when asked why, only that someone important to my family believed in this place, and I wanted to help keep it running. Nathaniel read that line 4 times. He hadn't told a single person, not even Rosalind, the full extent of what that clinic meant to him, that it existed because of a conversation he'd had years earlier with Marisol, back when Sophia was still in nursing school, about how difficult it was for families like theirs to access basic care without crushing debt. He'd funded the clinic quietly, anonymously even to most of his own foundation staff, never once publicizing it, never once treating it as anything more than a tax-efficient line item buried in a much larger portfolio of giving. He hadn't realized Sophia knew where it came from. He certainly hadn't realized she'd remember it, let alone honor it, once he was supposedly gone. He asked Marcus to arrange something delicate, not a meeting, not yet. Nothing that risked exposing the entire operation before he understood what he was looking at. Just proximity. A reason to be near enough to observe her directly without revealing himself. It happened almost by accident, 3 days later, at the clinic itself, where Nathaniel, wearing a plain jacket and the beard he'd grown over the preceding weeks, unrecognizable enough to pass as any ordinary visitor, sat in the waiting room, pretending to fill out paperwork while Sophia worked a shift nearby, laughing gently with an elderly patient, adjusting a blood pressure cuff with careful, unhurried hands. An older man in the waiting room, clearly a regular, struck up conversation with her while she worked. "You're here a lot more than you used to be," he said. "Everything all right?" Sophia's expression shifted, something quiet and unresolved passing behind her eyes. "I guess I've just been thinking a lot lately about a man who made a place like this possible for people, like my mom and me, back when we needed it and couldn't have afforded it otherwise. He passed a few weeks ago. I never really got to thank him properly. Coming here, helping out, it's the closest thing I have to doing that now." "Did you know him well?" "Not really," Sophia admitted. "I don't think he ever thought much about me at all, honestly. But he changed the whole direction of my life with one decision most people would probably call small. I don't think that kind of thing needs to be repaid with money. I think it just needs to be honored properly, quietly, in a way that actually matters." Nathaniel sat frozen in his chair, gripping a clipboard he wasn't actually using, listening to a woman he'd nearly forgotten existed, describe the exact opposite of everything his own daughter had shown him over the preceding 2 weeks. Gratitude requiring nothing, offered by someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from offering it, for a kindness so small in Nathaniel's memory that he'd genuinely forgotten the details until she just described them back to him. He left the clinic before his composure fully broke, sitting in the car outside for nearly 20 minutes before he could bring himself to call Marcus with new instructions. "I need everything you can find," he said quietly, "on Sophia Reyes. Not surveillance. I need to understand who this person actually is. Because I think I might have spent $14 billion building relationships with exactly the wrong people, while somehow, without ever meaning to, doing something that actually mattered for someone I barely remember." Great. The deeper the investigation went, the more Nathaniel understood how completely he'd misjudged where value actually lived in his own life. Sophia Reyes wasn't visiting a grave and volunteering at a clinic to perform grief for anyone's benefit. She simply believed, quietly and without complication, that a debt of gratitude existed and deserved honoring, regardless of whether the person who created it was alive to notice. 2 weeks after the funeral he hadn't attended as himself, the will reading finally arrived, and Nathaniel watched the aftermath unfold through Rosalind's careful reports with the specific, sickening clarity of a man confirming exactly what he'd feared rather than discovering something new. Charles contested provisions almost immediately, hiring an aggressive estate attorney to argue that certain trust structures unfairly favored Vivian's line of the family. Diane, informed that a significant portion of the estate was tied up in a foundation structure that couldn't be liquidated quickly, hired her own counsel within days, quietly probing whether the foundation's charitable commitments could be legally challenged or restructured to free up additional funds for personal distribution. Vivian's reaction was the one that finally, fully broke something loose in Nathaniel's chest. Rather than contesting anything directly, she'd begun quietly meeting with a business consultant about restructuring the boutique with new capital, language that made painfully clear she was already planning her inheritance's deployment before the ink on any legal document had dried. When a mutual family friend gently asked how she was holding up emotionally, Vivian's answer, relayed secondhand through the investigator's notes, had been brief and telling. "Honestly, I haven't really had time to process it. There's just so much to sort out." Nathaniel sat with that sentence for a long time. So much to sort out. Not grief. Logistics. He thought about the letters locked in his study drawer, written the night before he disappeared, and wondered now what version of each person would eventually read them, whether any version of Vivian existed anymore that would read a father's final words and feel anything beyond calculation about what came attached to them. Harold's board maneuver moved forward exactly as feared. The buyout clause activated within the month, acquiring Nathaniel's shares at a valuation that would net Harold hundreds of millions in unrealized value the moment the market properly repriced the company without a grieving estate desperate to simplify its holdings. When a journalist asked Harold, during a brief press availability, how he was processing the loss of his longtime partner and friend, Harold's answer had been smooth, rehearsed, entirely hollow. Nathaniel would want the business to keep moving forward. That's the legacy I intend to honor. Nathaniel had built that company from nothing alongside this man. He'd trusted him through 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and 1 genuinely difficult year when Harold's own father had been dying and Nathaniel had quietly covered his responsibilities without ever mentioning it, without ever expecting credit. Watching Harold repurpose his death into a convenient acquisition opportunity confirmed something Nathaniel had suspected for years but never let himself fully examine. Partnership, to Harold, had always been a transaction wearing the costume of friendship. Sophia, meanwhile, continued showing up to the clinic 3 times a week, taking on extra shifts, quietly building relationships with patients who had no idea of any connection to the man whose fortune was currently being dismantled by people who'd actually known him. She never once tried to contact the estate, never once mentioned Nathaniel's name to reporters, despite at least 2 outlets eventually tracking down the story of the clinic's anonymous benefactor and reaching out to volunteers for comment. When one persistent journalist finally cornered her outside the clinic, asking directly whether she had any personal connection to Nathaniel Cross worth sharing, her answer, captured briefly in a minor local piece that never gained wider traction, was simple. I think if he wanted that story told, he would have told it himself while he was alive. It's not mine to tell for him. Nathaniel read that quote sitting alone in the cabin, and something in him finally, completely shifted. He had spent his entire adult life believing that visibility equaled value, that love had to be loud, demonstrative, attached to something measurable, or else it wasn't quite real. He had poured that belief into every relationship that mattered to him, translating affection into tuition payments and trust funds and expensive vacations, and in doing so, had apparently taught nearly everyone close to him that this was the only currency worth speaking in. Sophia Reyes, who owed him nothing beyond a single decade-old check he'd barely remembered writing, had somehow understood something none of them had, that gratitude, loyalty, real love, didn't need to be loud or documented or repaid in kind. It simply needed to be lived, quietly, consistently, especially when no one was watching to notice. He called Rosalind that night with a decision he'd been circling for days, finally solid enough to say out loud. "I need to come back," he said. "Not yet, but soon. I need you to start preparing the legal groundwork, how we handle the fraud exposure, how we manage what happens once people learn the truth." And Rosalind, he paused, something tightening in his throat that hadn't tightened in years. "I need you to find out everything you can about arranging a meeting with Sophia Reyes, alone, before anyone else knows I'm alive. You understand what you're asking," Rosalind said carefully. "The moment you reveal yourself, everything changes. The people who've spent the last month planning around your absence will have to answer for what they did in it. That includes people who love you and made mistakes out of grief, not just the ones who revealed themselves through greed." Nathaniel looked out the cabin window at the dark tree line beyond, thinking of Vivian as a little girl, before the private schools and the credit cards, before he'd taught her, without meaning to, exactly what kind of currency mattered most between them. "I know," he said quietly, "but I can't keep hiding from the truth just because part of it is going to hurt. I asked to know who actually loved me. I don't get to walk away now just because the answer wasn't what I hoped for from everyone I expected it from." Rosalind arranged the meeting with Sophia first, 3 days later, at the clinic after hours, when the last patients had gone, and only Sophia remained, finishing paperwork alone under the fluorescent lights. Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him, still wearing the beard, still dressed plainly, and when she finally looked up, and recognition slowly assembled itself across her face, disbelief, confusion, and then something sharper, something that looked almost like fear, he understood immediately that this conversation would cost him something he couldn't fully predict. "You're supposed to be dead," she said quietly, standing very still, gripping the edge of the desk. "I know how this looks," Nathaniel said. "I know there's no version of this that doesn't sound insane. But I needed to explain it to you before you heard it from anyone else or saw it on the news." He told her everything, the overheard conversation in his study, the suspicion that had calcified into certainty, the plan he'd built to remove himself and watch who remained honest in his absence. He told her what the investigation had revealed about his family, his partner, the people he'd trusted for decades. And then, carefully, he told her what it had revealed about her, the cemetery visits, the volunteer shifts, the quiet, unclaimed gratitude she'd carried for a decision he'd made almost thoughtlessly years earlier. Sophia's expression, as he spoke, moved through several distinct stages, and the one that finally settled, the one that broke something in his chest, wasn't gratitude or vindication, it was hurt. "You used my grief to test whether I was good enough to matter to you," she said slowly. "You watched me visit an empty grave. You watched me talk about you to a stranger in a waiting room, not knowing you were sitting 3 feet away. That's not touching, Nathaniel. Do you understand how that feels? Finding out someone let you mourn them as an experiment?" He hadn't considered it that way. Not fully, Not until she said it plainly. He had been so focused on what the deception would reveal about everyone else that he hadn't fully reckoned with what it cost the people who happened to pass the test. "You're right," he said quietly. "I wasn't thinking about what it would do to the people who actually cared. I was only thinking about exposing the people who didn't. I'm sorry, that's not an excuse. It's just the truth." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, arms crossed, something working itself out behind her eyes. "I don't want anything from you," she finally said. "I need you to understand that clearly, before whatever comes next. I wasn't visiting that grave hoping you'd come back and reward me for it. I did it because it felt true to something my mother taught me. That decency doesn't require an audience to be worth practicing." "I know," Nathaniel said. "That's exactly why I needed to see you before anyone else." The family reveal, 3 days later, unfolded exactly as painfully as Rosalind had warned it would. Nathaniel called a private meeting at the estate. Vivienne, Diane, Charles, Harold, all gathered in the same study where this had begun weeks earlier, none of them aware of what was about to happen until he walked through the door, alive, and the room fractured into 5 completely different reactions at once. Diane's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediate, and, Nathaniel noted with a complicated ache, genuinely difficult to categorize. Relief, certainly, but also something that looked uncomfortably close to panic. The particular panic of someone realizing decisions made in someone's absence were about to require answering for. Charles went pale, then defensive, immediately launching into an explanation about the will contest that sounded rehearsed, before Nathaniel had even asked a single question. Harold simply stood very still, already, visibly, recalculating the buyout he'd pushed through weeks earlier, understanding in real time that fraud exposure now worked in both directions. Vivienne said nothing for a long time. She simply stared at her father, standing alive in the doorway of the study, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than Nathaniel had heard it in years. "You let me grieve you," she said. "You let me sit at your funeral and cry. Actually cry, Dad, while apparently testing whether I deserve to keep crying. Do you have any idea what that does to a person?" "I do now," Nathaniel said quietly. "I understand that I hurt you by doing this, even the parts of you that were honest. I need you to know that too. This wasn't only about catching people out. It was about finally seeing clearly, and I didn't fully understand, until I was standing outside my own family looking in, how much of what I built between us over the years taught you that money was the only language I actually spoke." The consequences unfolded slowly over the following months. Legal, financial, deeply personal. Harold's buyout was unwound through careful negotiation rather than public scandal, though the partnership itself never recovered, dissolving quietly within the year. Charles's will contest collapsed once Nathaniel's return made it irrelevant, though the relationship between the brothers remained distant, polite, permanently altered. Diane and Nathaniel separated within 6 months, not through explosive confrontation, but through the slow, honest recognition that whatever they'd built had never quite been built on the foundation either of them had pretended it stood on. Vivienne took longer, but eventually, in a conversation that lasted until nearly dawn one night at the estate, father and daughter began the difficult work of learning an entirely different language between them. One that didn't route every form of care through a checkbook. One built instead on the kind of ordinary, unglamorous presence Nathaniel had avoided for most of her life. As for Sophia, Nathaniel didn't pursue her, not romantically, not as some tidy resolution to a story that had already asked too much of her. Instead, he did the only thing that felt honest given everything she'd taught him without meaning to. He funded the clinic properly, publicly this time, at her insistence, and hired her, at her own request and on her own terms, to help run its expansion into 2 additional underserved neighborhoods, work she'd wanted to do long before any billionaire's death had briefly complicated her life. Nathaniel Cross had spent $14 billion and one elaborate, painful deception trying to discover who truly loved him. In the end, the answer wasn't a name, or a single grand gesture at a cemetery. It was smaller and harder than that, and truer for it. Love had been there all along. In a decade-old tuition check he'd nearly forgotten writing, in a quiet decision to help, simply because helping was right, and he hadn't needed to disappear to find it. He had only needed to finally learn how to see it.